Hey, Moonshiner, have you heard that version 3.0 has been released? Hurry up and upgrade from version 2 to version 3. Today, we'll go through a quick upgrade guide from version 2 to version 3. We'll update the third Moonshine demo, which is the smallest one, a to-do list. But this will allow us to go through the main challenges of the upgrade. Let's try updating, but first, let's quickly go through the text-based upgrade guide. I've already upgraded several projects, and overall, this guide covers all the issues. The most important thing, of course, is to change the dependency. Then, the guide immediately recommends backing up 3 files: dashboard, config, and provider. This is done so that later, you can quickly move your logic to the new structure. If your config file hasn't changed at all, you don't need to back it up. It will be replaced with the new one, and you probably won't even notice. The same goes for dashboard. However, you will always need to transfer the menu from the Moonshine service provider. So either back it up or copy the menu somewhere to insert it into the new structure later. Next, we proceed with the installation and update the composer dependencies. Then comes the routine part, changing namespaces and modifying some logic. For example, instance resources used to be everywhere, but now it's just a string class. The provider will change, along with everything else we will encounter. It's also important to note in the upgrade guide that many features from version 2 have been moved to separate packages. This includes import, export, some metrics, code highlighting fields, markdown fields, tinymce fields, and more. Why was this done? For example, I personally don't use import, export in 100% of my projects. When I do, it's easy to add it via Composer require and use it. There were also big concerns with metrics, which pulled in a huge number of assets but weren't always needed. The same goes for the highlighting field, which I rarely used, yet it was included by default. And the same applies to visual editors. Now, you'll decide for yourself which editor to use and install it as needed. We'll go over everything else during the upgrade process. Okay, let's start with the first step recommended by the upgrade guide, changing the dependency to 3.0. Let's go back to the project, open composer.json, and change Moonshine to 3.0. Okay, next, let's take a look at what's going on in moonshine.php in config. We see that nothing has changed in this project. This config file hasn't been overwritten anywhere, so we can just delete it. Also, if you're using Laravel version 11 or lower, go to app.php, find the Moonshine service provider in the provider list inside app providers, and remove it. If you have Laravel 11 or later, remove it from the provider. We'll run the installation command, and it will recreate it. Let's take a look at what it looks like now. First, we see that the compact theme is enabled. In Moonshine 3, you no longer need such a large amount of code. I'll show you later how it's done, and overall, we won't need this. I chose a simple demo that doesn't even have resources or a menu. In most projects, you'll need resources and pages. If you registered them separately, just copy them here in the menu. Move them somewhere convenient for you, and we'll come back to them later. For now, let's just remove the providers. Okay, now let's look at Moonshine layout PHP. Pay attention to this, it will be moved to a different directory and completely changed. In this case, we modified it, trimmed it down, removed the menu, and so on. We'll do the same ourselves without even looking at this layout. Let's delete it. The most important part of this demo project is the dashboard. If we open it, we see that everything happened on this dashboard. We added tasks, dragged them, deleted them, and marked them as completed. A pretty interesting demo. In this case, it would be good to keep the dashboard. Okay, let's do that by simply renaming it. Great. The next step, let's go back to the console and run Composer up. We encounter a problem. One of the dependencies, Moonshine Builder, I don't even know why it's in this demo, I don't think it's used, but we see it in the dependencies. It also needs to be updated. As far as I remember, version 2.0 is available, which is compatible with Moonshine 3. Okay, now everything is good, no errors. Let's move on to the next step in the upgrade guide, which is performing the installation. Either you have backups or you've moved those 3 files elsewhere. In our case, we only backed up the dashboard, so let's proceed with the installation. During the installation, I expect another issue. The installation process has changed. Let me enlarge the screen for you. Actually, nothing changed. Okay, we now have options. During installation, we can immediately enable MoonShine authentication. In most cases, we should enable it, and it's set to yes by default. Next, we're asked whether to use system migrations. In MoonShine 3, these include users, roles, and notifications, if you use the database driver. Let's say yes. This is what I mentioned earlier, enabling notifications in MoonShine 3. You can choose to enable or disable them. You can also disable them and implement your own logic using the provided abstractions. Okay, we'll keep it enabled. Now, here's an issue that will cause a problem. The issue arises if you've upgraded MoonShine and were already using notifications. You already have migration tables, and MoonShine 2 enforced this logic by adding migrations. But in MoonShine 3, this is now optional. Migrations are now published through Laravel commands. Let's see how this looks. We're also asked whether to use the compact theme. By default, it's set to no, let's leave it as is, but I'll show you later how to switch it quickly. And now, we see the error. What happened? Let's check the migrations. Laravel has already published the migration file for notifications, but we already have them. All we need to do is delete them. That was the last step of running migrations. The next step would have been creating a user. If you're upgrading from version 2, migrations have already been applied, and your user is already created. If you specify no for migrations during installation, you won't need them. Version 3.0 doesn't introduce any new fields in migrations. The only change is that notifications are now optional. Socialite tables are also removed and moved to a separate package. So, to summarize, if you're upgrading and have used system migrations before, choose no. If you haven't used them but want to, choose yes. If you encounter an issue with notifications, just delete them. This is the last step. You can ignore this error. Or, select no when asked about using database notifications and later go to config and set use database notifications to true. Okay, that's sorted. We can see that a new config file has been published. In some ways, it's similar to the old version. Some structure has changed, some things were removed, some were added. In MoonShine 3, everything is as customizable as possible. All forms and tables are now moved to config and can be easily published via the command line. They will be replaced in the config file and published to your MoonShine directory. Okay, now let's make sure everything went correctly and that the MoonShine service provider has been added to providers.php. Alright, looks good here. Now, let's take a look at the MoonShine service provider itself. It's undergone significant changes. Previously, we had some syntactic sugar with methods for resources, pages, menus, themes, and so on. Now, all of that has been moved into the boot method. Here we have DI, dependency injection. The core is required, of course, as well as the config. We've injected that. The asset manager is needed too, so we've added it. Whatever you need, just add and use it. If you need to declare resources, you do it right here. In MoonShine 2, when creating a resource, we had to manually add it to providers and the menu. In MoonShine 3, this happens automatically. You create a resource, and it appears here and in the menu, which we'll get to shortly. Whether you're using the compact theme or the default one, there's no need to modify anything in providers. Now, let's move on to the dashboard and see what it looks like. Namespaces have changed, method naming has changed, but overall, the structure remains the same. So, here's what I suggest. Take the old dashboard, copy it, paste it here, and delete the original. Then, we'll go through it together and adapt it to version 3.0. You'll need to do the same with resources. This kind of routine work, changing namespaces, switching some properties from public to protected, renaming the title method to getTitle, will be necessary. All these questions are covered in the documentation, which is why I took the lazy route with a simple MoonShine demo. Okay, let's get back to the dashboard. But before we do, let's take a look at layouts and talk about the menu. This is an important change compared to version 2.0 and other admin panels. We now have layouts, and everything related to UI customization has been moved here. Each page can override its own layout through the layout property or a method. Right now, it's not suggesting anything because we don't know what page we're working with. Each page can have its own layout, which loads right before render. We don't need any callbacks. We can customize the menu directly here based on conditions, even can see is largely unnecessary because everything is already in place. As for the default and compact themes, in 2.0, you had to deal with a ton of code just to change colors and add extra classes. In 3.0, it's enough to simply switch app layout to compact layout. And just like that you get a compact theme, no extra steps needed. A second, and it's changed. In our case, with the to-do list, we don't need assets. We won't have a menu, so we can remove user role resource.php, but we can leave it, it doesn't get in the way. We also won't be changing colors. As you can see, colors are now managed at the layout level, but you can also set them globally through the service provider. Here's an interesting point about layouts worth noting. We didn't immediately extract all the component blocks. Instead, we just set up a parent build. If needed, you can either fully extract these components and customize them or use the ready-made quick methods. Head components, logo components, we took logical sections and moved them into methods. This way, you can easily override, modify, or completely change parts without dragging everything along. In our case, let's take everything here, move it over, and adjust it to match what we had before. We'll also remove get sidebar component, and as far as I remember, get header component wasn't there either. The header, components, everything else looks accurate. We might need to remove another class or two. As for get footer component, that one was there. Okay, that's sorted. Again, this is all covered in the upgrade guide. I'll also be making a development guide for MoonShine 3, where we'll go over the new menu manager, color manager, and so on in detail. But that's more about development, not upgrading. If we refresh the page now, nothing will work. Let's fix everything manually. Of course, the upgrade guide has details on which namespaces have changed, and you could use a replacer to update everything in the project. But in most cases, the IDE helps. Just hover over an issue and update the import. First, let's clean up everything that has issues. Alright, let's go. Dashboard page, okay, yes. Laravel page, looks good. Next, we immediately see some method issues. Breadcrumbs have changed to get breadcrumbs. Even without the upgrade guide, you wouldn't get far without fixing this. Then we see a problem with title, it's now get title, so we update that too. Moving on. The method handling the component list is now protected. If you leave it public, it won't break anything, but it's better to update it right away. Next, we have action button, let's import it. Did anything change in action button? Not much, but icons have changed. We no longer need to specify hero icons outline, it's now handled at a higher level. Just do this instead. An outline is now the default. If you're using solid, specify S. For compact, use C. For micro, use M. The entire hero icons set is available, so there's no need to explicitly specify them. Moving on, nothing is being flagged, so we trust it for now. Let's import the next component. Okay. Now, regarding tables, there have been some changes. We no longer need to modify the attribute bag itself, we just need to return an array. Let's adjust that. Data is usually wrapped in data wrapper because it can be of any type. Thanks to this wrapper, we can easily access the original data, its key, and that's the most important part. Okay, we've sorted out attributes. It's an array. Next, if cell equals 0, we return a specific array, otherwise, we do nothing. Now, we see that cast, or rather, caster, has changed. Let's update it. We'll keep model clustering, but we need to change model cast make to new model caster and pass the to-do item class. Okay, now, about sortable, there was a naming issue in version 2. The table itself was sortable, and the field responsible for sorting was also sortable. But in reality, within the table context, it's reorder, so we've renamed the method accordingly. Let's update it to reorderable. Everything else stays the same, except it's flagging a resource method since we're using getter setters. We've standardized everything, so let's update that too. Like this. GetRouter has been moved to a separate object that contains all get endpoints available for MoonShine on Laravel. So we need an async method. We call it and specify which one we need. Now, about the buttons in the table. The first thing that stands out is the incorrect path to the icons. Let's fix that right away. But there's also an interesting detail here. We've already worked with action button in the inModal method over here when adding a task. This inModal appears only once on the page, so it doesn't need a unique name. But in the table, each button has its own modal, and it needs a unique key so the button knows which modal to open. This is a convenience feature that also generates an additional modal component. The button simply triggers an event to open it. To make this work, we need to add a name. We can't just set it to something like update task, because it would be the same for every item in the table, making it non-unique. To generate a unique key, we need access to the data itself. So, we use a callback and define the naming inside, like task update. Looks good, let's move on. No more issues here. Items, list fields, let's do the imports. And here, we'll also clean up the path. Regarding icons, you can use a replacer to remove all instances of hero icons outline in one go. Positions, stack fields. In most cases, imports will need to be updated. Just a quick note, many of the methods we're fixing now might not exist in your project. These are additional methods in this dashboard to avoid code duplication and improve usability. Now we see another caster, so let's update that too. Okay, everything else looks fine for now. As for resources, though this isn't a resource, the fields method no longer exists. Instead, we now have index fields, form fields, and detail fields. You'll need to update these when working on resource upgrades. Let's update the imports here as well. Great. Next, we have the async method. Looks good. Toast. I don't see any more flags. Let's check and refresh. It might work, or it might not. Okay, we made the imports on the first try, and we can already see that the dashboard is working. Let's check if the cards are being added. They are. Now, let's try editing. That works too. Let's reorder them. And we can see that's working as well. Let's test this button. Yes, we see the congratulations message, and the card disappears. So that was a quick upgrade guide. As I mentioned before, this is a large project with a massive demo. When I did the upgrade, one resource alone had tons of fields and logic. It took me about an hour, but it was mostly routine work. I wanted to show you how to go through each import manually in the IDE. If I had used a replacer, it would have been much faster. But in any case, we've successfully upgraded to 3.0, nothing too complicated. And that's it, friends. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your likes and comments, sending you all a handshake, and I'll see you in the next video on the MoonShine channel.